Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another session in the Faculty of Medicine's It Starts With Us series. This series supports the faculty's commitment to transform our culture through our learning and work environments. I'm Rosalind Goldner, Executive Director, Respectful Environments, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion in the Faculty of Medicine. The Ready Office is responsible for leading our Transforming Culture initiative and ensuring that we take all the steps that we can across the faculty to realize our aspirational, respectful, inclusive, and discrimination-free environments. I know that many of you are attending this session from across the province, some of you from the Faculty of Medicine and perhaps some of you from the community. We are all on traditional unceded territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, I am in my home office located on the ancestral unceded land of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish. My reflections of an immigrant grateful to be on this land are shaped by two facts. First, the unearned privileges and benefits bestowed upon me by accident of birth and geography. And second, the cruel treatment and abuse of human and collective rights of those who are of this land that were imposed by policies and actions of colonialism and systematic discrimination. I know I must use the first fact to work toward ameliorating the ongoing damage of the second if I am to show genuine gratitude for being on this land and to help make amends for what has been done to this land and its Indigenous peoples. We are hosting today's session, Contextualizing and Educating about the Holocaust, to commemorate the upcoming International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is celebrated on January 27th. This is an annual UNESCO tribute to the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. This is a day not only for remembrance of victims, it is a day to reaffirm our opposition to anti-Semitism, racism, intolerance, and hatred. A day to remind us that we must be ever vigilant and no longer complacent. A day to stand up against all forms of discrimination so that the post-Holocaust cry, never again, is not just a phrase, but a principled cause against hatred, discrimination, and genocides everywhere and against all peoples. For some of you, the Holocaust is perhaps a relic of the past, associated with an unfamiliar world war, too distant to feel pressing, to feel relevant. However, the consequences of the Holocaust are with us today. And if we are to end those consequences, we must heed the lessons of the past. These lessons are particularly relevant in medicine and the health professions. The Holocaust was not the first genocide, nor was it the latest. It was unique, however, in that it was a genocide that involved the active participation of medicine and science. These lessons are relevant to our commitment within the Faculty of Medicine to change our culture, to fulfill our contract to each other expressed in our strategic plan, to create respectful and inclusive learning and work environments that create safe spaces of belonging for a diverse community. We cannot achieve our goals if we fail to appreciate the relevance of the lessons of the Holocaust, particularly the lessons about the power of words and the consequences of othering. Othering involves attributing negative characteristics to individuals and groups of people, seeing them as fundamentally different from an alien to ourselves. Seeing others as alien fosters a dehumanizing discourse that demeans and diminishes, allowing us to persuade ourselves that these others who are not like us are lesser than and are not worthy. They do not belong and therefore can be placed out of our sphere of moral concerns. Othering is a process of stereotyping, discrimination, and hatred through which we become accepting of conduct toward the others that we would not otherwise accept for ourselves or those like us. Conduct that spans the continuum from denial and exclusion to violence, crimes, and even genocide. Othering is antithetical to our values and to our commitment to create a community of safety and belonging. There is a very real human tendency to misremember the evils of history, to imagine that they happened in a different world, to think that those who perpetuated such evil or those who remained silent observers were somehow different kinds of people than we are. We must not only remember, we must remember correctly and with courage to face the lessons to be learned. Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel said, "Without memory, there is no culture. Without memory, there would be no civilization, no society, no future." It would be a grave mistake to abandon memory, to ignore the lessons of the past that have the power to compel and guide us to fight for and to promote social justice, human rights, and the creation of our aspirational environments. This day of remembrance calls upon us to remember the lessons of the Holocaust, to stand up to hatred, intolerance, and racism, and all forms of discrimination. We are fortunate today that representatives of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre agreed to present this session. It is a session that I believe will challenge us to remember and to learn. I invite Nina Krieger, the Executive Director of the Centre, to make introductory remarks and to guide us through this thought-provoking presentation. There will be an opportunity for a question and answer period at the end. We ask that you put your questions in the chat. You can put them in as they pop up into your mind throughout the presentation, and the chat will then be moderated by Abby, who is with us today. Thank you very much for joining us. And Nina, please.
Thank you very much, Rosalind, for your kind introduction and your powerful remarks. And our thanks to the Respectful Environments, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion team at UBC's Faculty of Medicine for hosting this important program. I'm honored to join you today and to offer greetings on behalf of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. Founded by Holocaust survivors, the VHEC is Western Canada's leading Holocaust museum, dedicated to the promotion of social justice, human rights, and genocide awareness. Education is at the heart of our name and our mission, and we typically engage more than 25,000 students each year from across British Columbia and beyond. On Friday, the VHEC will join Canadians and the global community to observe International Holocaust Remembrance Day. This day is dedicated to education and reflection about a watershed moment in history, the state-sponsored systematic persecution and murder of 6 million Jews by Nazi Germany and its collaborators between 1933 and 1945. The Nazis targeted millions of others on racial and ideological grounds and carried out a genocide against the Roma. In Nazi-occupied Europe, there were more than 44,000 camps, ghettos, and other sites of detention, persecution, forced labor, and murder. In this system, whose scale defies comprehension, Auschwitz, the site of the murder of 1.1 million people, 1 million of them Jews, has come to represent what human beings are capable of. It offers a harrowing entry point for grappling with the enormity of the Holocaust. On January 27, 1945, the advancing Red Army entered the Auschwitz-Birkenau extermination complex, liberating some 7,000 remaining prisoners who were for the most part ill or dying. Days earlier, the SS had forced nearly 60,000 prisoners to evacuate the camps and embark on the infamous death marches, in which many thousands lost their lives. The United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in November 2005 to designate this date, the 27th of January, as the International Day of Commemoration in memory of the victims of the Holocaust, the day upon which every year the world would mark and remember the Holocaust and its victims. This Friday, on the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, we will honor those who survived and mourn those who did not. We will also reflect on the dangers of anti-Semitism left unchecked and the role that each of us can play in being vigilant against hate in all forms. This is perhaps more urgent than ever, and globally and in our own backyards, we have witnessed a rising tide of anti-Semitism, racism, and xenophobia. We've encountered mounting Holocaust distortion, which includes statements and actions that seek to minimize, misrepresent, or even excuse the Holocaust. This trivializes the lived experience of survivors and jeopardizes the lessons learned from the Holocaust, which include the value of diverse and inclusive societies. The Holocaust also prompts important questions about the role of professionals and civil leaders in contributing to the persecution of Jews and other groups. After all, Nazi leaders required the active help and cooperation of professionals working in diverse fields, ranging from civil servants, lawyers, judges, doctors, teachers, police, members of the military, business elites, to church leaders. Studying this history is deeply relevant to the present day, offering insights into the consequences of complicity, inaction, and indifference in the face of injustice. This makes learning opportunities such as this one so vital, and I commend the UBC Faculty of Medicine for dedicating time to this important topic. It is my honor to introduce today's guest speakers. Professor Chris Friedrichs is a distinguished scholar of German history who taught at the University of British Columbia from 1973 until his retirement in 2018. He is a specialist in European history with interests in the history of early modern cities and the history of Jews in Germany. Professor Friedrichs has won international recognition for his research and university awards for excellence in teaching and in service. A son of refugees from Nazi Germany, Professor Friedrichs has been deeply engaged in Holocaust education and remembrance activities in Vancouver. He is a life fellow of Vancouver Holocaust Center Society in recognition of his contributions to the VHEC's mandate. Professor Friedrichs has enriched our community with his scholarship and his service, and today he will provide a historical overview of the Holocaust. Our second speaker, Dr. Robert Krell, was born in Holland and hidden during the Holocaust. He graduated from the University of British Columbia with an MD in 1965 and continued his psychiatric training in Temple University in Philadelphia and at Stanford University. He returned to UBC and in 1970 became a fellow of the Royal College of Physicians Canada, and in 1971, a diplomat of the American Boards of Psychiatry and Neurology. As a noted professor of psychiatry at UBC, Dr. Krell became internationally recognized for his scholarly research and public lectures on the psychological trauma of Holocaust survivors and their children. In his professional career, Dr. Krell was director of residency training for 10 years, and for 25 years was the director of child and family psychiatry at the UBC Health Sciences Centre and BC Children's Hospital. He served as professor of psychiatry until 1995 when he became professor emeritus. Dr. Krell's commitment to social justice led to one of his most extraordinary goals, to create a permanent legacy in the form of a Holocaust-based anti-racism education center for the citizens of British Columbia. This culminated in the opening of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre in 1994, with Dr. Krell as founding president. He remains a dedicated outreach speaker and has shared his story with tens of thousands of students and audiences across North America and beyond. In fact, 10 years ago this week, he delivered a keynote address at the United Nations in honor of International Holocaust Remembrance Day. Following our two speakers' remarks, there will be a panel discussion and opportunity for questions moderated by the VHEC's Program and Development Manager, Dr. Wener Herlin. Thank you again all for joining us, and it is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Chris Friedrichs.
All right, thank you very much, Nina. Thanks for the invitation to participate in this program. I'm sure I need scarcely explain to an audience like this what the Holocaust was, because as we surely all know, that term refers to the relentless murder of almost 6 million European Jews by the German Nazi regime and their allies and collaborators in almost 20 European countries during the Second World War from 1939 to 1945. Of course, the Nazis had many, many other victims, including many Germans themselves. But the term Holocaust is normally referring to that huge portion of their victims who were Jewish. It was one of the worst genocides in known history. And in many ways, it continues to be the single most important template for even understanding the concept of genocide. And that brings me to the central question I hope to pose in my remarks, And I wish to do so with illustrating what I want to say with some slides, which I will open now. I hope they help us all understand or appreciate some of the issues involved in this very complex topic. Clearly, the Holocaust was not the only significant case of genocide in modern history. This, what you see here, is just a very, very abbreviated list of some of the most significant cases of genocide in the 20th century. There were many, many more, and genocides continued to take place and continue to take place in our own century. One of the most horrific was the Holodomor, the massive death by starvation of millions of Ukrainians in the early 1930s, ordered by Joseph Stalin and carried out by the maliciously simple method of requisitioning every single basket of grain harvested by Ukrainian peasants to be sent to industrial districts, so that the peasants and their families would simply starve to death. But the Holocaust had a number of significant features, which not only make it unique or highly distinctive, and thus also make it the most important example of genocide that continues to reverberate today as we confront other genocides and incipient genocides all over the world. And the Holocaust has very specific lessons and implications. So for anyone engaged in the study or practice of medicine, the Holocaust has some very specific meanings. So I'm going to try to identify some of the features that made the Holocaust so distinctive and so important to try to understand as we consider the broader question of genocide as a feature of human history. To start with, the Holocaust was based on anti-Semitism. Of course, hatred directed against another ethnic or religious or national group lies at the heart of almost every form of genocide. But what we now call anti-Semitism has existed for well over a millennia. It's one of the longest lasting, possibly the longest lasting form of hatred addressed towards a particular group in world history. It was deeply entrenched in medieval European society when it was customary to revile Jews for their unwillingness to convert to Christianity and for their economic activities, which Jews often practiced for the very simple reason that they were forbidden to own land or to practice crafts and trades practiced by Christians. When the bubonic plague, the Black Death that devastated Europe in the late 1340s, during the Black Death, Jews were accused of causing this dread disease, typically by the accusation that they had poisoned wells. And in some communities, Jews were burnt to death for this alleged and totally untrue crime. But the term anti-Semitism, is a modern one. For anti-Semitism in the modern form is an amalgam of this deep-seated hatred of Jews in European society and a new element that was introduced in the 19th century. That new element arose from the growing interest in exploring the physical and cultural differences between various humans in a systematic way. Some of the intellectual activity in this new form of this new type of interest actually developed into the modern study of anthropology. But in other forms, this new way of thinking became the allegedly scientific study of how specific groups were physically, morally, and culturally superior or inferior to other groups. This was what came to be known as scientific racism. This illustration from an English book of the late 19th century was typical of this widespread form of pseudoscience. This particular page was supposed to demonstrate that based on physical characteristics, Irish people were more similar to Black Africans than to Anglo-Saxon English people, as a way of justifying the idea that the English were superior to the Irish. The same kind of so-called science was marshaled to demonstrate that Jews were fundamentally inferior to other Europeans. And just as was said by almost all Europeans at that point, that the native people of Africa were both inferior to Europeans and at the same time dangerous because of their allegedly warlike nature, Jews were also seen as not only inferior, but also dangerous, not by warlike behavior, but by their allegedly evil economic and antisocial machinations. Racial science was also clearly linked to eugenics, the so-called science of ensuring that only people who conform to specific standards of alleged normality should continue to be born or should continue to exist. Such ideas of this sort, were prevalent among countless European intellectuals and social leaders in the late 19th and early 20th century. But they took particularly deep root in Germany, especially after the First World War. When the Nazis came to power in 1933, racial science became one of the core principles of Nazism, of National Socialism. It was part of the curriculum of every German classroom. The same ideas were communicated to gatherings of the Hitler Youth and its parallel organization for girls, and training sessions for soldiers, in other programs of education and socialization for German adults from 1933 on. To believe in racial science was a fundamental expectation imposed on the German people. Another distinct feature of the Holocaust, so one feature is how it arises out of anti-Semitism. Another distinct feature of the Holocaust was the step-by-step way in which the ground for it was prepared in Germany. Now, of course, every episode of genocide requires a certain amount of planning and coordination and collaboration by people acting together to kill large numbers of other people. But the Holocaust was in a class by itself because of the way it came about. Hitler achieved power in Germany through quasi-constitutional means because of the strong support his Nazi party had developed since the late 1920s. But if Hitler had announced right from the beginning that a Nazi government would murder every Jew in Germany, it is clear that most German electors would have shied away from such a party. So when the Nazis came to power, they began with small steps. Communities like the one I'm showing here, communities were encouraged to make Jews feel unwelcome. People were urged not to patronize Jewish-owned stores and businesses. Jews were barred from specific jobs or professions. But year by year, the Jews of Germany were subjected to more and more restrictions on their freedom of activity, designed to separate them from their neighbors and make them live as social pariahs, but always step by step. So people would get used to one level of this social isolation, and then the next step would just seem a slight extension of that. But were not slight extensions at all. The list of things got longer and longer. Professions Jews could not practice, events Jews could not attend, belongings Jews could not even own. By 1938, the ground had been sufficiently prepared to make it possible for the Nazis to torch hundreds of synagogues all over Germany in a single night, and to destroy Jewish-owned businesses by the thousands the next morning. And the same restrictions that had been placed on Jews in Germany were applied in Austria and Czechoslovakia when the Germans took over those countries in the late 1930s. Yet another crucial factor in making the Holocaust so distinctive and so important to understand was the role played by war. This was not unique to the Holocaust. The Armenian genocide was carried out by leaders of the Ottoman Empire during the First World War. And to this day, the Turkish government describes what the rest of the world has come to recognize as the genocide practiced on the Armenian people who lived in Turkey. The Turkish government continues to describe this as nothing more than a routine transfer of populations suspected of disloyalty in the wartime situation. But what happened to Jews after the Second World War began was on an unprecedented scale. Beginning in 1939, the Nazis invaded country after country. And they now claimed that any Jews anywhere were inherently enemies of Germany and therefore needed to be regarded as dangerous people who had to be rendered incapable of doing any harm to Germans as a matter of so-called wartime necessity. In many of the invaded countries, Jews were forced to leave their homes and live in special communities called ghettos, sections of cities which were separated from the rest of the city by walls or barbed wire, supervised by Nazi officials and patrolled by Nazi soldiers. Often numerous families were crammed together in a home or an apartment originally built for one family. At first, the Jewish leaders tried to maintain something like normal life. They set up schools and shops, but in fact, the ghettos were nothing more than big prisons. Some of the Jews in the ghettos were put to work in factories or workshops to make supplies for the German war effort. But the ghettos had more Jews than the Nazis needed for that purpose. It would be convenient for the Nazis if there were fewer Jews. And this could be easily achieved simply by the fact that the Nazis controlled the flow of food and medicine into the ghettos, and they made sure that there was never enough. Jews in the ghettos began to face more and more disease and malnutrition. If parents got sick or died, there was nobody left to look after their children. Then, beginning in 1941, it got even worse. Hundreds of thousands of Jews in the areas of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, which the Germans had invaded, were rounded up and simply murdered. Often, they were taken out to some field near where they lived, forced to dig long ditches, then lined up and shot so that they would fall into the ditches they themselves had dug. Once enough people, dead or alive, had fallen into the ditch to fill it up, The bodies were covered with dirt, and the Germans moved on to the next village. And if the people tried to escape, they were chased down, like this Jewish woman and her baby in Ukraine in 1942. By the beginning of 1942, however, the German leaders decided that this method of getting rid of Jews was not efficient or effective enough. So in January of 1941, a conference was held at a beautiful villa next to a lake in a suburb of Berlin known as Wannsee. At this conference, a group of 15 Nazi leaders and government officials sat around a table to discuss what they considered a problem they had to solve. These were not thugs. They were highly educated men who held top-ranking positions in the German bureaucracy or in military or quasi-military organizations. And these highly educated men did not talk about the fact that they were planning the greatest crime in world history. To them, it was just a practical operational problem. How to get rid of all the Jews in Europe. One of the officials had done his homework before the meeting. He had drawn up a list of the number of Jews still living in Europe at the time, both in the countries already occupied by the Nazis and in the countries they had not yet conquered, such as Great Britain, for a total of 11 million Jews to be eradicated. And after carefully studying this list, the German officials spent a few hours discussing the most efficient and effective way of getting rid of these human lives. And then, having worked very hard planning the murder of potentially 11 million human beings, they adjourned to the dining room next door for a very nice lunch. After which, in accordance with what these leaders had decided, in the next few years, millions of Jews in the areas controlled by Germany were gathered up from the ghettos or from their own homes, if they still live there, transported by trains, stuffed into old boxcars originally designed for transporting cattle, but unlike cattle, given no food or water for the journey, and delivered to special camps. Many people died of hunger or thirst or starvation right in the trains. Those who were still alive when the train arrived at a camp stumbled out of the boxcars. In some camps, everyone who arrived was killed on arrival. In other camps, such as Auschwitz, some of those who arrived were assigned to work as slave laborers on a starvation diet. Others were assigned to special facilities where so-called medical experiments would be carried out on them. These experiments were conducted by medical doctors whose professional ethics required them to heal illness and preserve life. But Jews did not count. These torturous experiments were like using animals in medical research, nothing more. The most notorious of these medical researchers was surely Josef Mengele, but he was not alone. Dozens of medical doctors at Auschwitz and elsewhere carried out very similar experiments. But most of those who arrived at Auschwitz, especially those who were too old or too young or looked too weak or were pregnant, were assigned to what is sometimes misdescribed as instant death in the specially constructed gas chambers, because the death was not really instant. It might take up to 45 minutes before the last desperate person in the gas chamber gasped his or her last breath. You know, one might think that mass murder is a very rough and violent undertaking. And to some extent, and in some places, such as Rwanda, it normally was. But in the case of the Holocaust, parts of the murder process were very orderly and involved detailed paperwork. One reason is that before the Jews died, all of their property was taken away from them. Their homes were given to new owners. Their bank accounts were transferred to other people. Their possessions were confiscated until everything they owned was reduced to one small suitcase. Then, as soon as they arrived at the camp, even that one small suitcase was taken away to be checked for anything it contained that might be valuable. Even after they died, any parts of their body that might be useful, their hair perhaps to make wigs, or the gold fillings in their teeth, had to be carefully removed before the body was burnt in a crematorium. Everything, every single thing the Jews had was valuable to the Nazis, everything, that is, except for their lives, which were considered worthless. The way in which this whole operation was carried out, with highly trained lawyers, generals, soldiers, professional engineers, medical doctors, and government officials, all playing their part in depriving the Jews of their property, organizing their transportation, separating them on the basis of so-called medical criteria into those who would be killed immediately and those who would be killed more gradually by exhaustion or starvation. All of this makes the Holocaust the most distinctive case of genocide in recorded history. Another factor that makes the Holocaust so distinctive in the history of genocide is that more than any other genocide of the 20th century, the details of the Holocaust are staggeringly well documented. Whatever we know about the Holodomor, or the Armenian genocide, or the Rwandan genocide, and we know very much, still does not begin to compare with what we know about the Holocaust. One reason for this is that the Nazis themselves were such meticulous record keepers. They tried to keep what they were doing secret from the rest of the world, but they were proud of their work in trying to eliminate all the Jews of Europe. And they wanted to keep a record for themselves of their achievement. Consider this very famous picture of a boy being rounded up to be deported from the Warsaw Ghetto to Auschwitz in the summer of 1943. This picture was carefully preserved in the files of the SS commander, Jürgen Stroop, who was in charge of that operation. And this picture was found in his files after the war had ended. Or consider that picture of a Jewish woman being shot in a field in Ukraine. It was not taken secretly by somebody who was horrified by what the German soldier was doing. It was taken by another German soldier who put down his own rifle long enough to take out his camera because he wanted a record of what he and his companions were accomplishing in the Ukrainian campaign. Many of the people involved in carrying out the Holocaust, the people we refer to as perpetrators, told their stories after the war. Some of them were forced to when they were put on trial for murder or crimes against humanity. But many others told their stories quite willingly to historians or interviewers. And there are masses and masses of surviving documents about all this. Altogether, there is an abundance of information about the perpetrators, which has contributed to making historians and psychologists and others try to understand who the perpetrators were and why they did what they did. Of course, thousands and thousands of perpetrators whose activities are so well documented were still just a few of the vastly greater number of people who were also involved in perpetrating the Holocaust. We must remember, after all, that the Holocaust was carried out with the help and assistance of hundreds of thousands of men and women. To round up and kill 6 million human beings was a big job, and it took a lot of work. We know that some of the people who were engaged in rounding up and enslaving and killing the Jews were in fact sadists or sociopaths or psychopaths, kind of people who take actual pleasure in causing pain to others. And unfortunately, we know that such people exist in every society, including here in Canada. We as a society try to stop such people from carrying out their evil wishes. By contrast, the Holocaust permitted, even encouraged people like that to carry out their perverted intentions. And that is a frightening aspect of the Holocaust. But what is even more frightening is the fact that most of the people who participated in the Holocaust were not sadists or psychopaths or sociopaths. They were simply ordinary people who had been told or taught that they had a job to do and figured that they must obey their orders and do what they were told to do. The fact is that shooting people in front of their own graves, pulling babies away from their screaming mothers, locking the doors of the gas chambers and opening them again when the screaming has stopped, was very unpleasant work. Of course, the very worst of the jobs like dragging the dead bodies to the gas chambers or the crematoria, from the gas chambers to the crematoria, were left to Jewish slaves to carry out before they themselves were murdered. But even so, everything else was done by the perpetrators themselves, and most of them did not particularly enjoy it, but they did it. In fact, some people thought this work was so unpleasant that they simply refused to do it. After the war, German soldiers often claimed that they did not want to kill Jews, but they had to, or they themselves would have been shot for insubordination. But this was not true. It has been well documented that some German soldiers or policemen flatly refused to do this kind of work. And when that happened, they normally suffered no severe consequences. They were simply labeled as weak-willed or uncooperative and were given other assignments. But if soldiers or guards or policemen wanted to be respected by their friends or their officers or get promoted, they did perform this work because someone had told them it had to be done and they thought they should. But there is another reason why we know so much about the Holocaust. And that is because, in fact, it did not completely succeed. The Nazis did not kill every last Jew in Europe. Some Jewish families got out of Europe in the nick of time. Some Jews went into hiding, helped by non-Jewish people who brought them food and clothing. Of course, many of those who went into hiding were betrayed and rounded up and sent to their deaths in the camps. I'm sure most of you know of the most famous such case, that of Anne Frank and her family. But some Jews who were in hiding did survive. Some Jewish children were rescued by Christian families or nuns who sheltered them, often at risk to their own lives, and kept them alive. But it was a hard experience for these kids. Even if they did not fully understand why, they knew that they were somehow different from other kids. They knew that there were things they could not do or had to do to stay alive, and often they never saw their parents again. There were other survivors too. Some Jews were still alive in the concentration camps or death camps when the war ended, because the Nazis had not yet worked them to death when the camps were liberated by Russian or British or Canadian or American soldiers. Here is an image of some of the survivors of the notorious Buchenwald concentration camp who were still alive when the American troops liberated them in the month of April 1945. One of them was Elie Wiesel, who not only survived, but spent his life writing about his experiences and describing them before and during everything he had experienced before and during the Holocaust, and eventually became a spokesman, an eloquent spokesman for human rights and the need to respect human dignity throughout the world. So we know a lot about what happened in the Holocaust. But why did it happen? That sounds like a very difficult question, and in some ways it is. But the basic answer is really quite simple. The Holocaust happened because people had been taught to believe a certain idea. It is the idea that some people are better than others, not because they have better personal qualities, but simply because they belong to a superior social or ethnic or religious group. And that all of the members of some other group are thus inferior. That their language or culture or traditions are intrinsically less valuable, and therefore their language or culture or traditions or even their very lives should be wiped out. Genocide happens because some people were taught to despise other people, not because of who they were, but because of the group they belonged to. This German soldier had been taught to hate this woman whom he had never seen before, not because she had done anything to him or anyone else, but because she belonged to a group which, he'd been taught, was intrinsically bad and dangerous. She was Jewish, so she deserved to die, and so did her baby. Of course, all of us make choices all the time about some people being more useful members of society than others. Some people should get admitted to university, should be singled out for recognition, should get this or that job. That is inevitable and understandable. The danger is when such decisions are not made on the basis of individual ability or talent, but on the assumption that the members of some group or community are inherently more valuable than others. That is the idea that is behind every form of genocide. And that is what was behind the uniquely horrific series of events referred to in the Jewish world as the Shoah and referred to more generally as the Holocaust.
Thank you, Professor Friedrichs. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Krell, who is our keynote Holocaust survivor speaker today. For technical reasons, Dr. Krell has pre-recorded his remarks, but he will be joining us live for the question and answer. We already have some wonderful questions, but please continue to share them in the chat. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Robert Krell.
Dear friends, I was born on August 5, 1940, in the Hague Hollow. Only 3 months earlier, on May 10, 1940, the Netherlands was occupied by German forces in a surprise attack. My first 2 years were described to me after the war ended. During that period, Dutch Jews had been deprived of ownership of radios and bicycles, were expelled from the professions, and were forbidden to go to the beach or sit on park benches. Shopping hours were restricted, and Jewish children were banned from public schools. By May of 1942, Jews were forced to wear a yellow star by order of the Nazi regime, and deportations had begun. Apparently, there were rumors, but no one really knew what it meant to report for resettlement to the east. On August 19, 1942, we received orders to report to a certain place to be sent to Camp Westerbork in North Holland. From there, every Tuesday, a train left packed with 1,000 Dutch Jews. The destinations were Auschwitz and Sobibor. In Sobibor, the arrivals were murdered within a few hours. In Auschwitz, a few men and fewer women were selected for labor and worked, starved, and beaten to death. Most women and children, as well as the elderly or infirm, were murdered in gas chambers. Of 108,000 Dutch Jews deported, about 5,500 returned. All in all, over 80% of Dutch Jews were dead by liberation. My parents had not heard anything from their friends who reported in May, June, and July of 1942. They disappeared. We went into hiding. My father was in the attic of a partner in the fur business, my mother entirely on her own in a small apartment elsewhere in the city, and I was placed with a neighbor, then miraculously with the Munich family. My first clear memory is from age 2. When staying at my first hiding place, Mrs. Mulder's teenage son accidentally bumped my head against an overhang while giving me a ride on his shoulders. I complained loudly, "Hofistote, pitcha down," bumped my head. Peter did it. My next clear memory is from November 1942, when my father visited, sat me on his lap, and instructed me not to call him dad, but uncle. I was then with my new mother, Violette Munich, new father, Albert Munich, and 12-year-old sister, Nora. I was now Robbie Munich, the only family member with curly black hair. My mother visited in January 1943, a visit I do not remember. There were 1,000 moments of possible discovery or betrayal. We were lucky, and Frank and her family in Amsterdam were not. They were betrayed and sent to Auschwitz. Eventually, Anne and her sister Margot died in Bergen-Belsen. I participated in my survival by never complaining, and I did not cry. I did not report illness or pain, and still do not, sometimes courting disaster. I was not allowed to look out the front window. We ate red beets and tulip bulbs and an occasional rabbit. The Munichs loved me and tried to make me feel safe, but I knew something was terribly wrong. Nora taught me to read and write at age 3 or 4. Until liberation on May 5, 1945, I was sort of okay. On the night of freedom, I was put to bed in the usual time. This time I protested and I cried and howled about 3 years worth. Then my parents returned for me. They felt like strangers, but they convinced me I was theirs. So I went home with them. There I learned I was Jewish, although my first school was a Catholic kindergarten down the street. My Jewish learning came from hearing the stories of Auschwitz survivors trekking through our living room. I heard of train rides of 3 or 4 days without food, water, or toilets. I heard of death and madness, and whips and dogs, gas chambers, and burning pits. And whatever I could not understand, they spoke in Yiddish. My 8-year-old second cousin Millie translated for me. The only other surviving child was my first cousin Nolly, whose parents had both been murdered. We 3 kids were the leftovers. And we started school and we played with each other from time to time, sometimes went to the beach at Scheveningen and pretended we were normal. I learned later, much later in life, that by the time I was 2 years old in 1942, The German army had, during its invasion of the villages, towns, and cities of Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and other republics of the USSR, enabled mobile killing squads, Einsatzgruppen, that followed them to murder the Jews in the territories they had occupied. Father Patrick Desbois, a French Catholic priest whose grandfather had been taken to a camp in Ukraine named Rava Ruska, one day told him how awful it was, adding that it was worse for the others. The others were the Jews. At age 35, in December of 1990, Father Desbois immersed himself in the study of the Holocaust and discovered that before Auschwitz, the Einsatzgruppen, deploying the force services of locals and of volunteers, massacred the Jews wherever they lived in systematic killings by shooting them into mass graves. Desbois set out to identify these abandoned graves and found elderly witnesses who described the horrors they witnessed as well as their participation. This was the Holocaust by bullets, and the descriptions defy belief. Every witness described how the graves moved for 3 days. Not every shot was fatal. The wounded were simply buried alive with the dead, as were the infants not worth a bullet. The numbers are numbing. In one village, 300, in a town, 6,000. At Baba Yar, a ravine near Kiev, 33,671. By 1942, 1.5 million Jews had been murdered, all that in Eastern Europe. Then the Shoah, the Hebrew word for Holocaust, became more serious in Western Europe. And apparently no one knew or believed the isolated reports and rumors to be true. On January 20, 1942, the final solution was planned at the Wannsee conference near Berlin. And in addition to bullets and bayonets, gassing vans and gas chambers were added to the killers' methods. Railroads formed the delivery system to the killing sites. It was an enormous operation, this war on Jews. It did not stop or even slow after D-Day, June 6, 1944. Germany had not yet finished murdering Hungary's 850,000 Jews. While Germans were at last being defeated in battle, they continued their war of genocide. I started school in Holland and did well. I had a good friend and my cousin Millie. My two sets of parents became friends. All this you can read in my 2021 memoir, Sounds from Silence. It is available from Amazon or Indigo. We left the Netherlands for Canada in 1951. I felt as if we had escaped Europe, but we could not escape the consequences of the Holocaust, the Shoah. And throughout my life, some very smart people advised me to put it behind me. How wrong. It is there, and one must live with it, side by side with ordinary life. In fact, many child survivors that I know describe living on two tracks, their concentration camp or hiding past, and simultaneously their post-war lives. It makes sense. I had become Hobby Munich, who gradually returned to Hobby Krell, developed a Jewish identity, and merged it all into my new identity as a physician graduating from the class of 1965 at UBC. For those of you who perhaps feel that these events so far away have little relevance to life today, allow me a few stories as to its likely impact within our university and within our medical profession. Yes, even here. As brand new medical students in 1961, my class received an introductory lecture from Dr. Kaspar Nadli. He was a brilliant sociologist whose specialty included the sociology of medicine. Dr. Nadli became the Dean of Arts. I took a class on the sociology of deviance in third year. Nagley had spotted me in a line signing up for third year classes, called me over and told me I looked sufficiently deviant to take his course. It turned out that he was a refugee from Nazi Germany, among several thousand Jewish teenagers of great intellectual promise, spirited via Britain to internment camps in Quebec, where they were held for up to 3 years as enemy aliens because they were German. The administrative geniuses of the time could not distinguish victims from perpetrators. At least 4 became professors at UBC. Peter Oberlander, Gideon Rosenbluth, Ernest Poser, and Nagley, all saved from the Shoah. One who did not come to UBC was Walter Cohn, K-O-H-N, who told me in Santa Barbara, where I had given a talk on child Holocaust survivors, that he had applied to UBC's Department of Physics, writing that he knew a little math and physics. He received a particularly nasty letter of rejection, something like, "You will never be accepted here." So he went to the US, where he eventually won the Nobel Prize for Chemistry. Dr. John F. McCreary, Dean of Medicine, invited me to his office to see a model of his concept of a health sciences center, one that was first built at McMaster. I was flattered. My 4th year, as the Medical Undergraduate Society president, I was invited to his home. There, I spotted a medal with the likeness of the Dutch Queen Wilhelmina. Dr. McCreary explained that he was the pediatrician who accompanied Canadian troops into Holland to assess the nutritional status of the starving children following the hunger winter of 1944-45. He received that honor for his efforts. Several years later, at a cocktail party, Dr. McCreary took me aside to tell me that he had made a one-day trip to Bergen-Belsen and had taken photos there. He showed me shocking pictures of open mass graves and allowed me to have copies made that are now in the archives of the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre, the VHEC. Dr. McCreary, why did you not talk of this? Should doctors not know what was done? You saw children who had been deliberately starved, evidence of mass murder, and the likely involvement of physicians amongst the murderers. He responded simply, I could not talk about it. The Holocaust was even closer than that. I knew Dr. Rudolf Verba, professor of pharmaceutical sciences at UBC. Rudy was the least known of the heroes of the Holocaust compared with Raoul Wallenberg or Chiune Sugihara. Yet he was responsible for saving more than 100,000 Jewish lives in Budapest, Hungary. Rudy, who was in Auschwitz for 21 months, escaped on April 7, 1944 with his friend Alfred Wetzler. They were 2 of only 5 Jews to succeed. They reported all they had seen to Czech authorities, and a report was prepared to try and save the Hungarian Jews from deportation. It took months for the Auschwitz protocols to have an impact, and by that time, only the Jews of Budapest remained. But they were being murdered by the Arrow Cross, Hungarian Nazis. That is, and several heroic rescuers stepped in to save the remnant. Rudolf Verba's book was published in 1963, titled I Cannot Forgive, written with Alan Bestick, and most recently reissued in 2021 as I Escaped Auschwitz. In recent years, local author Alan Twigg has made a film about Rudy and created a most informative website. British journalist Jonathan Freedland has published a biography of Rudolf Verba in 2022 titled The Escape Artist. Rudy and I became friends, and he shared with me moments in Auschwitz that, like Dr. McCreary, I cannot talk about. What Rudy saw and experienced defies imagination and beggars belief. One day, in his strongly accented voice and with his usual intensity, he said, "Robert, you must understand Auschwitz. In Auschwitz, everything was permissible." He passed in 2006. In his last year, I saw him every week. I've written about that in Sounds from Silence. The madness that unfolded in Europe under cover of World War II was not, in fact, confined to Europe. The Allies were aware at a relatively early date of the genocide of the Jews, although the word genocide was yet to be coined. And there have been conferences about what to do to help Jewish refugees to escape. And the answer was nothing. In Canada, an immigration officer asked how many Jews might be allowed into Canada. He answered, "None is too many." There was also madness in Canada and the USA, both of which turned back to St. Louis, a ship filled with German Jewish refugees who were forbidden to disembark. And it was sent back to Europe, where hundreds of its passengers were subsequently murdered. Sigmund Freud had to be rescued against his will, whisked away from Vienna in 1938 to safety in London. Even this great visionary could not envision what would happen. He thought his 4 elderly sisters to be safe. After all, 3 were in their 80s. He was wrong. Dolphy died in Theresienstadt. Rosa, Maria, and Pauline were murdered in Treblinka in 1942. And during this wretched time, 1939 to 1945, what of the medical profession in Germany? How did our medical colleagues behave? Far too many physicians of the great cultural centers in Germany and Austria submitted to fascism and Jew hatred. Physician promises to uphold the Hippocratic Oath and the Oath of Maimonides were shattered. And by 1939, doctors were murdering the mentally deficient and the handicapped mercilessly. In Doctors of Infamy, the story of Nazi medical crimes, published in 1949, Alexander Mitscherlich and Fred Mielke revealed the complicity of German doctors. Andrew Ivy, MD, the medical scientific consultant to the prosecution of the Nuremberg Military Tribunal #1, wrote, "From the time that I learned that the ethics of medicine were indeed violated by the Nazi physicians, and through silence which amounted to complicity by a large part of the German medical profession, I have in every opportunity sounded a warning that there appears to be no bottom to the pit of spiritual and moral iniquity into which the ideology of fascism insidiously leads." So what did German doctors educated at the great universities and medical schools do? How did they participate? Nearly half became members of the Nazi Party. Gerd Krieger relates that on March 31, 1933, Jewish physicians holding university, hospital, or faculty positions at the Charité Hospital in Berlin were told they need not appear for work the next day. Of a total staff of 277, the 96 Jewish physicians were dismissed. There were no protests from non-Jewish physicians. Can you imagine? 1/3 of your colleagues expelled for racist reasons, pure anti-Semitism, and no one speaks out? That is surely the beginning of the end. And it was. Likewise, the profession of law was perverted in only a few years, producing the racist Nuremberg laws by 1935. By 1939, medical doctors were engaged in the systematic killing of those they deemed to be life unworthy of life. The Nazi Party, having won power in a democratic election, received a clear message that it could exercise its dictatorial powers virtually unopposed. And so on July 14, 1933, the German Reich government proclaimed the law for the prevention of progeny, offspring, with hereditary diseases. Michalech and Miyake, again in Doctors of Infamy, stated that this became the starting point for a line of development that inexorably led to enforced mercy death for the incurable insane on the one hand, and during the war on the other, to plans for exterminating races declared to be inferior: Poles, Russians, Jews, and Gypsies. How did the medical killing begin? Frederick Werthmann, in his book, The Mark of Cain, published in 1966, writes that in July 1939, a conference took place in Berlin in which the program to kill mental patients in the whole of Germany was outlined in concrete final form. Present and ready to participate were the regular professors of psychiatry of the leading universities and medical schools of Germany, namely Berlin, Heidelberg, Bonn, and Würzburg. Who were involved? According to Wertham, they included Dr. Max de Krinis, professor of psychiatry at the University of Berlin and director of the psychiatric department of the Charité Hospital. He committed suicide in 1945. Dr. Wener Herlin, head of the Department of Child Psychiatry at Tübingen, then psychiatric director at Bethel, an institution for epileptics and mentally and physically disabled persons. From 1946, after the war, from 1946 to 1956, Willinger was professor of psychiatry at the University of Marburg. And in 1950 was invited to participate in the White House Conference on Children and Youth. Interviewed by prosecutors in the Limburger euthanasia trial, he subsequently committed suicide, as did Carl Schneider, who for 12 years held Emil Kraepelin's position at the University of Heidelberg. Dr. von Müller was convicted of having ordered the killing of at least 120 children and had himself taken part in the killing, mainly through systematic starvation. Sentenced to 6 years, he served just 2. Bioethics originated within the questions raised by concentration camp research during the Second World War. What Nazi doctors perpetrated prior to and during the war shaped contemporary medical ethics and medical morality as we now know it, and continue to struggle with its implications. Think of it. From the killing of children determined to be a social burden, physicians subsequently helped develop gassing vans in which thousands of Jews of all ages were killed, and then became the foremost expediters of death in the concentration camps and extermination camps. There they helped murder hundreds of thousands. At the ramps of arriving trains carrying Jews from all over Europe, physicians like Joseph Mengele greeted the terrified, exhausted arrivals and sent women and children to their deaths in gas chambers. He spared a few for labor, as well as some younger men, and also selected twins for his ghoulish experiments. How was it possible for post-war academic physicians to bypass this momentous and sordid chapter in medical misbehavior, the most flagrant abuse ever of medical responsibility? Was it too frightening for physicians to confront? Did they perhaps recognize the relative ease with which colleagues followed the Nazi path? Did they recognize within themselves the potential capacity for such behavior, given the right social circumstances? Many professionals may consider this historic chapter of evil in human existence to be receding into the past, without implications for medical practice today. But William Seidelman, by the way, a boy born in Vancouver, raised in Vancouver, emphasizes that Nazi medicine did not exist only in the period from 1933 to 1945, but in fact extends beyond the Hitler period and continues today. In 1989, he warned us of medicine's Nazi legacy in Mengele Medicus, medicine's Nazi heritage. Amazingly enough, doctors who participated in the most gruesome experiments remain cited in the medical literature. Dr. Seidelman names, amongst others, Dr. Ernst Rudin, who taught psychiatry at the University of Munich, where Joseph Mengele received a PhD, followed by an MD from the University of Frankfurt. Dr. Omar von Verschuer was a pioneer in twin studies and greatly influenced his students. Mengele subsequently played a major role in selection and experimentation as chief physician of the women's barracks in Auschwitz. Dr. Sigmund Rascher froze inmates at Dachau in experiments that, along with those of others, can still be found with a citation analysis of scientific journals. Dr. Seidelman, in his 1989 article in the New England Journal of Medicine, notes such references in the prior 10 years in the American Journal of Psychiatry, the American Heart Journal, and the American Journal of Cardiology. Rascher also experimented with blood clotting agents for war wounds. He simulated combat wounds by amputating extremities of camp prisoners without anesthesia, or by shooting prisoners through the neck and chest. As recently as 1994, a controversy arose with the appointment of Dr. Hans-Joachim Suhring as the World Medical Association's president-elect. Suhring had belonged to the SS, the Nazi elite guard, and his participation in the euthanasia program was confirmed. His nomination was challenged. The WMA had been created after the Nuremberg trials to advocate medical ethics. The WMA demanded the German doctor's resignation, and Suhring did so, citing a world Jewish conspiracy. He nevertheless had served as president of the German Medical Association from 1973 to 78, and in May 2008, the 25,000-strong German Federation of Internal Medicine awarded him the Gunther Budelmann Medal, its highest award for services to the nation's health system. There are compelling reasons why the Shoah should receive your attention and remain in your medical memory. It was not only a massive, brutal attack on the Jewish people that resulted in the extinction of 6 million souls. It was also a massive assault on humanity and an affront to humane behavior. We expect to be able to trust our architects to build safe bridges and buildings, our lawyers to respect our trust in legal matters, and our physicians to heal us and comfort us. But in this case, the mass murder of Europe's Jews, lawyers created the Nuremberg laws, physicians turned from healing to murder, architects and engineers built the gas chambers and crematoria, and doctors were involved at every step. Theologians and clergy encouraged the process actively and also passively through their silence. Even literature was forever changed by the language of atrocity. We had a new vocabulary that included genocide, the final solution, Cyclone B, deportation, gassing bans, Arbeit macht frei, work will set you free. The inhumanity symbolized by Auschwitz destroyed trust in humanity. And we must work hard to regain that trust. In Auschwitz, the compound that stored the stolen possessions of arriving Jews was called Canada. The inmates forced to work there saw it correctly as a place of abundance, as they imagined the country of Canada, a land of riches, of opportunity, of freedom. Yes, Canada was there in the minds of those who were dying in Auschwitz. So this is not just a lecture, it's a call to action. Let us resolve not to bring Auschwitz here, certainly not by design, nor by accident. Medical practitioners must remain on guard. Slippage is easy, the road back is hard. Be watchful of demands of you that ignore morality and ethical behavior. There is so little black and white in our profession and so much gray that it demands constant vigilance. But we're not alone. We have colleagues and teachers, students and patients. All can contribute. All must be alert. The late Elie Wiesel, survivor of Auschwitz and Buchenwald and Nobel Peace Prize recipient, has said, "Tell people the right stories and they will do wonderful things." Learn the stories of the Shoah and I believe that you will do wonderful things. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krell, and thank you to Professor Friedrichs. We'll now commence the question and answer, and we have some excellent questions. We'll try to distill them because I'm aware of the time. But I'd like to begin with asking a question to Professor Friedrichs, and I'm going to read it because there's a direct quote. This person quotes Jean Amery, who contemplated that, quote, "forgiving and forgetting induced by social pressure is immoral. That places the incomprehensible in the cold storage of history and thus falsifies it in a revolting way. Evidently, there are aspects of genocidal history that are irreconcilable. What are your thoughts on this?"
Well, it certainly is fundamental that forgetting is the greatest danger. I mean, I'm a historian, and one of the basic ideas of being a historian is that people should know about the past, and not just, I've never, in all of the years I taught history, I never suggested to students that human history is a story of regular progress, that things have gotten better and better as the centuries went forward, because human history is not a story of progress. Human history is a story of conflict and of, in many cases, tremendous tragedies that we are better equipped to deal with our own time by knowing something about. So the idea that it would be easier if we just forget things is, of course, something I would agree must be totally rejected. I think that learning about the past is important. And the only other thing I'd say, because I'm sure there's other questions, is to learn lessons about the past that are useful. In other words, it's not sufficient to say, well, Nazis are terrible. They were terrible. They did terrible things. But we have to, without making facile comparisons, we have to realize that there are human beings in the world today who are doing comparably terrible things, and we have to be alert and aware of what has happened in the past to make us more likely to raise our voices about things that are happening in the present.
Thank you. Dr. Krell, do you have anything you'd like to add to this question?
I think Chris has covered it beautifully. Thank you.
Perfect. So this is Segue Connected, and you did touch on it, Dr. Krell, throughout about current situations in Canada when you were going through medical school, but people are interested in that. They're interested in, quotas and, and universities and Jewish people being banned from clubs and other minorities. And of course, as you extend it today with your passionate call to action of what's still happening in our institutions and our departments. It's in the news today. Tell people about what's happening in Toronto. So I'm curious if you have anything to add about how we can remain vigilant, and also for Chris, if you, any history in Canada, particularly about anti-Semitism and where we find ourselves today.
I'd like to refer particularly to what survivors fought when I was a child. They came out of the concentration camps, and they said, when people come to know of what happened to us in there, they will never do such things again. So even with the experience of the worst, they had hope. And I would say that daily, over the last 5 to 10 years, we have seen evidence that in so many ways, it creeps back when we are not vigilant. As soon as we become, what should I say, careless, complacent, it creeps in. Perhaps it's part of human nature, as Chris said. We've seen historically nothing but conflicts from people, and somehow we feel that we are in a century, or have entered centuries, of cultural sophistication and great scientific achievement. And one would think that we would have made progress towards some inherent hatred and evil that represents anti-Semitism. And it seems to me that we're not doing very well in that respect. And since anti-Semitism, Jew hatred, is the canary in the coal mine, it is time that people take to heart the lesson that it may begin with Jews, but it never ends with Jews.
So throughout the chat, there has been a lot of sharing about subtle and not so subtle experiences with being othered, being read for Semitic appearances, encountering that in the university context and in society at large. And, you know, basically talking about how there's been echoes in institutions, but also simply the act of filling out a form where someone feels not white, but not other at the same time, and putting that in the context of what we can do to, you know, claim our identities, not be judged for them, but also to, in the context of anti-Semitism, and also how we can teach and kind of claim this and be comfortable in that claiming. And it's distilled by one commenter who talks about this idea of proximate whiteness and radicalization that's happening, that we're all experiencing in institutions. And they're wondering if both of you could comment on that in the discussion of anti-Semitism and, you know, with identity politics and sort of that discomfort that happens and that reading of bodies and how identities are formed.
I don't know quite which one of us you're asking to comment on that, but I guess
We were ready. Yeah.
There's enough there for a huge panel.
Yeah.
I mean, I will say one or two things about that. First of all, there's the consistent danger is people generalizing from one member or some member of a group to what they feel is allowed to think about all members of a group. This is one of the fundamental dangers. And I mean, I'm always, when I speak to high school students, always saying, it's not surprising that you talk about a fellow student and you say, well, that student is a jerk. Some people are jerks. But if you say that guy is a jerk, well, because of course he's a jerk, he's Filipino, that is when it begins. When you generalize from an individual to a group. And this is what Jews have experienced. It's not surprising that Jews are enormously concerned about this, because the hatred of Jews is just about the oldest group hatred that has been recorded in the last 2 millennia of history. And the fact that there are Jews in Canada today who are feeling targeted or singled out is unfortunately understandable. But we have to be alert as human beings to all the dangers. Just in the last few days, some terrible things happened in California that, for whatever reason, two men who were Asian or of Asian background committed terrible crimes. The danger is when people say, well, look at all these Asians, look at these Asian Americans, look at the element in that society, et cetera, et cetera. That's when these things begin. And the fact is that that kind of danger of generalizing to from any particular thing that happened to a general category is one of the most serious problems. But it is not to belittle the fact that some of the people who've evidently responded on in the chat questions have said, well, I'm Jewish and I feel vulnerable. So do many other people in many other groups feel vulnerable. And it's a problem of trying to persuade people, and it's always useful to try to begin when they're young, that people should not be identified and labeled by the group they happen to belong to.
Yeah, and particularly there's a discussion of surveys where, and this is just to follow up, the inescapability, of any group, we're racialized and we're read a certain ways, sometimes wrongly, some misrepresented. But, this has come up a few times in the chat and privately to me, the idea of EDI surveys, a long list of other ethnicities, and Jewish ethnicity is not listed. So this idea, and not all Jews are white, I want to add that as well. So the idea that, we have Sephardic Jews, we have many different types of Jews, but this categorization, and it's not going to be answered easily today, but it's interesting that this has come up, and I think you both, I can understand why. Is there anything to add in terms of that and the spaces here where we're looking for inclusion and striving for betterment and wanting to keep the conversation going? Maybe those surveys need to be rewritten. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I think that information is always helpful in formulating policies. So if there are surveys of one sort or other that give insight into the nature of prejudices and so on, that's helpful in terms of formulating policies. But on a more fundamental level, we know what the policies must be to try to educate and persuade people not to think in terms of groups. So, it's almost dangerous if you ask in a survey, what do you think of any categories? What do you think of Chinese Canadians? What do you think of Jews? What do you think of Black people and so on? It almost validates the legitimacy of thinking about groups as a group. And while on the one hand, it might provide some insights, and on the very same time might imply that it is legitimate to inquire what you might think of a group. We shouldn't be admiring or disparaging people by the groups they belong to.
I think we're very lucky to live in Canada, and for us particularly who are involved with Holocaust education, to do our teaching within Vancouver, British Columbia. Our diverse cultures are all represented in an auditorium filled with high school students. And I know in my heart that some of our messages get through to them simply because so many come from a background of immigration, of refugee families, and of others. They can identify with all kinds of pieces that are not necessarily Holocaust derived only, but all the experiences of Jews under persecution have the elements with which they struggle as well. And I think that's where we connect powerfully, So when I see a group like that, 500 of those gorgeous faces, it is my hope that they derive from our experiences some sense of hope for themselves. Some of us have made it with great good luck, have made it, and that's an example of what is possible. You don't come from a near murder in Holland and have the privilege of becoming a professor of psychiatry at the University of British Columbia without overcoming a few things, even though you don't even think of it in the process. But everyone has an opportunity. And the opportunity derives not from identification with a group. Okay. Not really. Not all Asians make it, not all Indo-Canadians make it, not all anybody makes it, right? But it does derive from a sense of cooperation with others, basic kindness to one another. And mentioning that basic kindness, I always worry a great deal in our society about the erosion of respect and dignity. And I actually worry about the language that is being used to teach children about diversity and other things, because so much of it borders on disrespect for what was done by those who did the right thing for us, those of us who paved the way, our elders, for example, our indigenous nations close by with all their wisdom that we seem to ignore. I've had the privilege of hearing some elders of them speak and just marvel at the manner in which they view the world and environment, nature. There's so much to learn. There's just too much that people should want to know and learn to spend time hating others.
We've learned so much from you, and I'm in the interest of time, I do want to say that I think we need to close, although this conversation could continue on, and we hope that we invite you to visit us at the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. You can find us at vhec.org. As we said, Dr. Krell and Dr. Friedrichs thankfully frequent our programs, our outreach speakers, and if you need to reach out to us, please do so. And we thank UBC and the Ready to program for having us today, and for all your engagement. And sorry if we couldn't answer all your questions. And we thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, everyone who participated today, and especially to the Vancouver Holocaust Education Centre. I hope this is just the first of our conversations on this and other important subjects. We have, as Dr. Krell says, we have much to learn. We have much to unlearn. And I think that we can embark on a very fruitful journey together, and to continue to impress upon our community the obligation to take these lessons from the Holocaust and to apply them to the work that we are trying to do within the Faculty of Medicine. Thanks, everyone, very much. This session is being recorded, and it will be available both on our website, and I believe the center's website is going to have a recording posted there too. So thank you for your participation today.